For about 48 years of my life, I was a diehard Trekker. I lived the difference between a Trekkie and being a hardcore fan. I collected merchandise, read the books, the comic books, especially loved the DC run, and I knew every series forward and back. I was that guy that Bill Shatner told to get a life on SNL. I was the guy you didn't want to talk Trek with. I was the nerd who knew Pavel Chekov's service number because he said it once on screen in Star Trek IV. That was me. With Discovery, I felt like something had drastically changed with Star Trek. I was screeched at and berated online. I was called every name in the book and described every version of Ism Archaeobia. Worst of all at the time, I was told over and over again that I never really understood Star Trek. About 2 years ago, I finally decided they were right after all, and I purged my life of every bit of merchandise, every bit of media, everything I had ever accumulated. I gave up Star Trek and really every other nerd franchise at the same time. Star Trek had been a constant part of my life. A little bit after that, Star Wars and a bunch of other things, since I was old enough to crawl, because I was born to parents who watched Star Trek. But I was agonizingly forced to the conclusion that, like pretty much all cinema in the century or so cinema has existed, its underlying themes and messages were nefariously intended to promote terrible ideas. The perverted, amoral garbage spewing out of Star Trek, STD, and others had always been the goal, had always been the underlying message. The indoctrination just hadn't been complete enough with me to like it. To be fair, the original Star Trek series was tremendous, along with so many other shows like MASH, All in the Family, The Jeffersons. The relevant and meaningful human stories told were well crafted and entertaining. But then the communist son-in-law was meant to be the hero of All in the Family. Communist appeasement was supposed to be justified by booze-brewing pranksters doctoring in their pajamas on MASH, and George Jefferson was just the beginning of introducing us to what we would come to know as critical race theory. What we called liberalism at the time was so thinly veiled, everyone knew it was in all of these shows, but we consumed them anyway for the other characters and the compelling nature of the overall entertainment. Likewise, Captain James T. Kirk was a man's man, an explorer of the age of discovery with his ship of the line, a frontiersman of the Old West leading a wagon train to the stars, pulling his phaser on bad guys that had it coming, always to protect the weak and innocent, and with a greater wisdom than previous ages. By intentionally creating a cast of characters of all nations, Star Trek was seemingly promoting a human future filled with unity, exploring for all the best of reasons. Even the Prime Directive itself is watered down throughout TOS. At one point, Captain Kirk even says the Prime Directive applies to healthy, thriving societies, not stagnant, dying ones. He doesn't hesitate to phaser or photon torpedo evil computer tyrants or alien deities to set people free to grow and develop and advance socially and technologically. Star Trek, like the other early shows mentioned, intentionally obfuscates its true goals in order to slowly adjust your thinking and catechize the viewer into a essentially Marxist worldview. It cleverly insinuates into its cast and crew cultures on Earth more backward than any they encounter in space, and in all such instances pretend that real biological, historical, and sociological differences mean nothing, and all the various moral beliefs are totally equal. The Prime Directive and the fictional hands-off nature of Starfleet are really intended to teach one how to think with moral relativism and to view backwards, primitive, and immoral cultural situations as just choices or characteristics that are all equal. Just as it did across all the programming of all the existing networks, these messages become more express and obvious in Star Trek as it goes on over decades. From Captain Kirk doing a relativist vague wedding in some sort of chapel, to Captain Picard's screeching atheist rants in TNG, Jadzia Dax making out with her previous spouse who just happens to be female, all the way to the endlessly bawling, diverse female space Jesus, somehow named Michael, being spiraled through time and space to become the alpha and omega of the entire Trek universe. There is a direct lineage and line. Why does this matter? I think it's extraordinarily relevant to our current situation in society as the culture war wages on and interesting currents begin emerging. Everything seems to be shifting in the direction of more conservative or more traditional worldview, although it's hard to apply those terms to 80s and 90s liberalism. Groups like Geeks and Gamers, Nerdrotic, Lord Doomcock, so many others on YouTube, who I enjoy, by the way. I'm sure there's no surprise there. However, there seems to be an overwhelming sense that what our culture needs to do is to turn back the clock to the 1980s or 90s when things were more reasonable and rational, but still very liberal. But that's not the real lesson of these last several years. Untalented Marxist hacks taking direct control of crafting our so-called entertainment destroyed all the franchises we grew up with and loved. But in so doing, they openly expose themselves by pushing too much Marxism too quickly. We must realize that just turning back the clock to the 80s or 90s only rewinds us for a time until we're right back to this exact same outcome. Facing the fact that all of our entertainment franchises and media, along with institutions such as education, the political parties, plural, every aspect of religion and society has been increasingly hijacked by this Marxist, relativist, CRT, feminist, whatever, inclusive worldview before it began calling itself Marxism. Only then can we begin an effort to reboot our whole civilization back to an actual, healthy, thriving society, and not just returning our entertainment to a time when it was better, but fixing things at a more practical, more long-term, more meaningful and deep level.